Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On this show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, franchising, and more. My name is Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the Deal Quest podcast. Let's get started. Deal Quest community, this is a solo cast, and in this solo cast, I want to talk about something that is triggered by some experience that's happening now in the wealth management space, where most of our listeners know we have a huge number of clients, and we do a lot of deals, but it's something that is not exclusive for that space. It's something that's certainly happening in the accounting space, it's happening in the legal space, and certainly in a lot of service businesses. And it's this conversation of the barbell effect. The conversation of, hey, first of all, is there this consolidation going on? Is this need to grow? Do you need to be big to compete? And what's going to happen to the smaller firms? And then what's happening in these various fields to firms, or what has happened to firms that are in the middle, okay? So what inspired me to think about this was that I've been speaking at a number of the wealth management conferences lately, and and just even in the industry press and in the discussions, there's a lot of discussions on what's happening in the industry as PE money has come in, there have been record numbers of M&A deals every year, and we did a lot of deals in this space last year. And as firms are trying to compete with these well-funded buyers for either acquisitions on their own, retaining key advisors who are getting recruited by all kinds of more players nowadays, firms that are expanding their offerings because they would argue that clients want it, but also that they have the capital and the management team and the ability to attract people to do so. And what is going to be the effect on that in the industry? So, for example, I spoke in, so I'm recording this in June. It might air later this month or early July. I'm not sure when it's going to come out. But in, I think it was in April, I was speaking at the RIA Edge conference in Nashville. And the topic of that talk, the main focus of that talk, was on alternatives to PE-backed, aggregators, right? What's happening in the PE space? What does that model look like? And what are some of the alternatives? After that, I was in Minneapolis in May speaking at the NAPFA conference. And for those who don't know NAPFA, who don't know the industry, NAPFA is a organization of investment advisors, of people who manage financial advisors, manage money, who are very, very committed to being fiduciaries. Now, most people in the independent RA space would call themselves fiduciaries, and certainly if they are fee only, as opposed to doing brokerage where there's not a fiduciary level responsibility. They, many folks who are not NAPFA members would consider themselves fiduciaries, but there's a very strong culture in NAPFA to be, very, very concerned. That's the highest priority. Many of the NAPFA members, for example, are willing to not sell to PE-backed aggregators for the concern that they will lose their independence. They will lose their ability to make sure that they're doing what's best for their clients by being in a bigger place, especially one that's funded by private equity, where there might be pressures to grow, that might cause things that they don't think might be aligned with what's in the best interest of clients. So it was a particular concern there, and the look at, hey, what are the alternatives? What can we do? In addition to my talk, which, by the way, was on employee incentive, attraction, retention, and incentive vehicles, which relates to this conversation, right? Because how does this firm that's not going to take money, that's not going to sell itself, that's not going to roll into a bigger place, attract and retain key talent, and how do they compete? And that allows them to more likely to be able to do internal succession, or to be attractive to an external buyer that might align with their values. And so we talked, that was my session. And then there was a like a community gathering that I participated in when NAPFA was looking at how they support their members to have them understand what the options are for them to be able to, monetize or sell or transfer, whether it's internally or externally upon retirement, in a way that aligns with their values and keeps things, sort of in the community. Um, then, subsequent to that, I spoke at the FPA NorCal conference, and that was again a topic on really internal successions, mergers of equals, basically alternatives to PE. So it's a huge topic in the industry, and really it's as if you study industries, there have been a lot of deals done when money's come into the space, etc. There was always this question, this challenge. The accounting industry is a great example of where this has happened, where it's like, okay, firms are getting bigger and bigger. Now, there was an interesting thing that happened in accounting. You used to have back in the day, I think it was the big eight, dropped out of the big four because they combined. But then, below that, you had this rung of firms that were getting, larger and larger. So the big four, now the big four, are huge, right? But then you have these firms like Eisner and Amper merged. They were two of that sort of next level run, down rung firms in terms of size below the big four. And they got together and consolidated. And, you've got various of these other firms that have either grown organically and or many of them have grown through acquisition. Aprio is a firm we do, a bunch of stuff, with, I know some of the partners over there. They're growing significantly. So what has happened in those spaces where there's been this evolution already? What is happening in the investment advisor space? The legal space is interesting because there are PE firms that have started to look in the legal space. Now, there's a whole thing with law firms in most states. You cannot have non-attorney ownership. There are exceptions. Arizona, for example, Utah has a limited exception. DC has had some exceptions for a while, but there are a bunch of guardrails on that in terms of, what role the non-attorney owners can play. But in most states in this country, you still need to be an attorney to own. But there are structures that PE firms are using that are similar to what was used for doctors, actually, in the healthcare industry for many years, where you have the same thing, ethically and legally. In most cases, you cannot own, you couldn't own a doctor's practice if you weren't a physician. So they do these deals through these managed services, agreements where basically they run, and PE is starting to get into the legal field more like this, where they run a non-attorney or non-doctor, right, non-medical practice, non-legal practice company that handles all of the back office, middle office, administration, billing, like everything that is not giving legal advice or medical advice. And they get paid a certain amount to do that. And then, they're able to sort of scale that back office. Maybe they provide some marketing, they provide billing, they provide systems, and that's what helps it get scalable. That's what the PE money invests in. And then the lawyers own the law firm part, the doctors own the doctor part, and they provide the actual licensed services that the other folks can't. So there's various models that are used in the various places, but the intention, right, is to create scale in professional and other service businesses. And that's what we're seeing definitely in the investment advisor space. So what is this concept of the barbell effect? Well, the barbell effect is this concept that it's tough to be in the middle. In other words, as the evolution happens, and accounting is a great example of where you've seen a lot of this, is that you end up with a bunch that firms that have grown, they become larger and larger and larger, and then you have the real small players, right? The boutique, the 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, 5, 10, under 10-person firms, right? That provide the contrast to the large firms. More personal relationships, more personal service, easier to, who you're dealing with, longer term sort of relationships with the direct relationship with the owners. All of the things that a boutique, smaller firm would pitch in contrast to the bigger firms. Maybe in certain industries, their fees are more reasonable. Maybe they provide, it's easy to access them, all of that kind of stuff, right? And frankly, listen, clients who are never going to be a good fit for the bigger players. Maybe the fee structures don't work. Maybe the level of work they need is under it. Or maybe they actually work with a smaller firm that does sophisticated work. I mean, we're a relatively small law firm, but we do very, very sophisticated work, and we're, up against the large firms. And when I say against, we're doing deals with the large firms on the other side of the table, the very large firms, all the time. But there are certain clients that would prefer to use us, even if they could afford, or there are other reasons to use big firms, just because of the level of customized and bespoke services and the relationship I have with them and my partners have with them and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's always this contrast that can be made. And what happens in some of these industries, and you've seen it in the accounting space, for example, it becomes tough in the middle, right? Because on the one hand, you either can create economies of scale, you can expand scope of services, you can have a more comprehensive offering to clients because you are much larger and well-funded. You also become more attractive to acquisition candidates, firms that want to tuck in and take advantage of that breadth of services and maybe get the administrative and back office, middle office stuff off their plate to free them up to be able to go out and get more business and focus on servicing clients or developing, new business, whatever their passion and role is. And then you've got, the smaller firms, which may provide a more limited scope of services that fit particular people. And in more of those cases, the professionals or the owners are working in the business. They're actually still providing services as opposed to, running the companies as CEO or management team. In the middle, it's hard to have the best of both. Often you have the worst of both, right? You have more overhead and things you have to cover. So you're probably not fee competitive with the smaller folks. You are not as, maybe accessible and customized and boutique, but yet you don't have the muscle and the scope of services and the funding for, to provide those services and or to pay the top people and or to do marketing in a way that the big firms have. So you end up in this very, very difficult place.
Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can tell you about an incredible resource my team and I have put together for you. Secrets of Deal-Driven Growth, Creative Ways to Grow Your Business Even in Challenging Times, is a powerful ebook that helps you take DealQuest podcast episodes and apply them to your own life and business. This is the ideal tool for anyone looking for creative ways to grow as deal makers, and you can get yours now. It's as easy as heading to corykupfer.com/workbook and downloading your copy. While you're there, you can also consider joining our dynamic deal-driven community of founders, experts, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. Now back to the show.
It's interesting. We have the Entrepreneurs Organization Lawyers Group, and we get together and, meet regularly. And I think, I mentioned it before. And and one of the things that, we talked about at some point, in fact, one of the attorneys often reminds me, I guess I made this comment at some point, that it's a lot easier to be a $2 million and below revenue firm or a $10 million and above revenue law firm. But in the middle, it's really, really tough. And it's for those exact reasons, right? It's a challenge to be in that middle part. And a lot of times you either get stuck there and then you have, turnover because your good people have better opportunities at the higher end, or, it's hard to recruit, or you're working a lot because you're not quite at the level where you can build a big, great management team. And, and it just, and then, or you're actually in that stage because you are looking to move to the bigger, like your goal is to be bigger, but you're in that stage where you have to reinvest. And there's always this, this stage, this crossing the chasm conversation, right? Which I think was a Godin concept, where you sort of get to a plateau and inevitably you have to invest, whether that's in technology and systems and people and management, to get to the next level. And you need to make those investments in advance of them paying off, right? In advance of them, actually creating additional revenue, right? Whether that's salaries, whether that's investing in technology, whether that's investing in more ops and admin people. And then it frees you up. And then if you do it right, you can get way beyond the plateau you were at to a next higher level. And in fact, it's near impossible to get to the next higher level unless you make that reinvestment and go through that dip or that chasm, right? So, so this applies across these industries. And these are all the reasons why it's very difficult sometimes to be in the middle. And I think, that's something, for example, in wealth management that we're going to see. We're far from it at this point. It's still pretty early stage. PE money has only come in heavily in the last 5-7 years. And that may sound like a long time, but it's not, especially because there's so many investment advisors who are still breaking away and leaving wirehouses and banks, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, the private banks, all that kind of stuff, the insurance companies. There's still so many new people feeding in that there are more new investment advisory firms forming every year than are acquired. But eventually this tension is going to, I mean, the tension is already there. And I think the middle will get challenged. We're not quite at the place where that's overwhelmingly significant right now, but if you look at the patterns from other industries, it's heading in that, in that direction, right? It's becoming, these challenges are coming up and people are looking for, hey, what are my alternatives to either big scale, raising capital on my own maybe, or rolling into a big firm, and how do I compete for the talent and how do I serve the needs of clients who may have increasing expectations of a more comprehensive service offering. Am I able to bring in, we have clients who are in that middle range right now in that field who've brought in, tax capabilities, who've brought in, maybe do insurance, maybe they've created a fund. And, that is still possible to play in that sort of middle space, but I wonder how much longer. It's not, I mean, not going to be next year or two, but I wonder a decade from now, what this industry in the wealth management industry is going to look like and whether it'll start looking much more like the accounting industry where there's, where the middle's got hollowed out and there is more of this barbell effect. It's interesting because what we're seeing like in wealth management right now is that there's this train running down the track, the PE train, and more PE firms coming in, more and more funded buyers. And then there's this backlash to it with some folks, like desperately looking at alternatives or talking about why that's not right. Certainly like some of the FPA advisors were clear that they didn't want to, the NAPFA advisors were clear that they didn't want to do that. So there's a lot of talk around that. It's really in the zeitgeist in the investment advisory field. And again, I don't, it's not, the middle is not hollow. We don't have a barbell anywhere near a barbell now, but certainly those discussions are starting to come up. If anybody hasn't looked at the 2026 Advisor Growth Strategies report, they highlight some of the stats and things that are going on around this dynamic of what's happening, with the bigger firms, smaller firms, and the move towards barbell. And then, DeVoe's latest quarterly report confirms that there are fewer buyers chasing more sellers in the RIA space, and that, the average seller AUM has crossed over $1 billion mark. I mean, again, I remember when $1 billion was a huge firm, right, in the space. Now that's considered a medium-sized firm because that's what happens as well as the definition of firm size goes up. I mean, I remember when I graduated law school, I understand I'm talking about ancient history now, right? But in 1985, I think, or maybe it was in 84 when I was a summer associate interviewing for jobs, Skadden Arps was the biggest law firm in the world, and that was 380 attorneys. I started out at a firm that was 280 attorneys. Those firms were considered very large firms. Those were huge firms. Nowadays, that's a medium-sized firm at best, right? Because the firms have thousands and thousands of attorneys. You didn't have that back in the 80s and into the 90s. It just grew. So those things, and you've seen that in accounting, and yet you're seeing that in wealth management. So it's interesting. I'm having a lot of these discussions with my wealth management clients, especially about, hey, what do they really want to do? Are they looking to, and do they feel comfortable with having an exit to, a serial acquirer, to a roll-up, to a big PE-backed aggregator? Are they looking to stay independent on their own and grow on their own? Are they looking to, do an internal succession? Are they looking to tuck in buyers of their own? Are they looking for a merger of equals, which is, frankly, the least common deal? I'm not saying there aren't mergers of non-PE backed, things that are positioned as mergers of non-PE backed RA firms or other firms, but frankly, most mergers are really acquisitions. They're positioned out like a merger, but usually somebody's got a true merger of equals would mean that the principals of each continue to run it equally. That's rarely the case. Usually there's somebody who's going to take over for the other, whether that's because they're bigger, whether that's because they're younger. And, part of it is these other folks are going to roll out, but those deals are still happening and people are looking at them. And so these things are interesting to look at in terms of the evolution of industries, being aware of where your industry may be going. And I've used the examples of wealth management and accounting and law, but this applies in a lot of other industries, service industries, and product industries. But certainly you see it in the industries that are around, like all the home repair and leaders and gutters and roofing and electrical, the trades, and the non-sexy sort of dirty industries. Some of them will call it. You've certainly seen consolidation, in that space, and you still have plenty of mom and pops, but again, those are spaces where you're getting some of that barbell effect, right? Where, you have this consolidation, bigger players coming in, more professional management, systemization, and that is making it harder to compete. And certainly, in the middle, in those spaces, it's more difficult as well. I think that's a common thing across industries where it's over time, as when bigger players come in, when there is scale and when there is money, that middle becomes tough. So I think it's important, whatever industry you're in, to sort of be aware of those evolutions and to look at what stage you are in your business and how that evolution, if your industry is going through it, may affect you and your business and what your values are, right? I mean, for example, when I was at NAPFA, there were plenty of folks who very much understood that they were not going to sell their businesses at anywhere near the multiples they can get, because from the principled basis, none of them felt comfortable selling to the PE-backed aggregators, right? Now, I'm relaying their view of that, right? There are plenty of advisors who feel very comfortable that these PE-backed aggregators are still going to be run by investment advisors who care about their clients and, are not in a brokerage model. They are in a fiduciary fee-based model, and they're still going to take care of the clients. And the argument is that they can take care of them even better because they can provide a broader range of services. So I'm not weighing in on the validity of that argument one way or the other, but the point is that depending upon your values, your goals for the business, the stage you're at, how quickly you think this evolution may happen in your industry, it should be an important data points for you in your business decision-making, because you don't want to end up in a place where you haven't made a conscious decision on how you want to grow or scale and or exit your firm and get surprised because you're not aware of what's happening in the marketplace in these industries where there has been money and scale happening and where maybe this barbell effect is coming into play a lot more. So plan for it as opposed to being surprised by it. All right, folks, that is the Solocast for this week, talking about the barbell effect and how you might be aware how it might be affecting your industry and what you should be thinking about. Definitely join us next week. We'll have another great guest interview. All right, folks. Corey Kupfer signing off.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. If you are interested in finding out more about my law firm, the services we provide to entrepreneurial and growing companies across industries all over the country, and my partner Brian Megan and I, and my amazing team, just head over to kupferlaw.com. That's kupferlaw.com, and if you want to follow more of my content, head over to my LinkedIn page where I post regularly. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.